Good evening and welcome to Straight Talk. I'm your host, Eugene Chan. Our guest tonight is Mr. Amos Lee, who is an international property veteran with over 20 years of experience. He is also a columnist in overseas property investment for several local newspapers and financial publications. He is with us tonight to tell us if investing in overseas property is a wise move. Welcome, Amos.
Hi, Eugene.
You're here tonight on a topic that a lot of viewers will be interested to know, if investing in overseas is a wise move. As you know, many Hong Kongers are global citizens. They have either studied overseas or have lived there, and they may have bought a property for their children. But your job is very different. You are involving in helping people to buy and sell properties. I believe you have been involved in more than $10 billion worth of properties, quite a large amount. So you are the best person to share with us. So for those people who are not very familiar with investing overseas, can you tell us why should we invest a property which is overseas but not in Hong Kong?
Sure. I think over the last few years, international property has really been quite a hot topic. People are, why are people moving from Hong Kong to overseas? Because number one, Hong Kong property prices are really, going up and has never come down at all. And then number two, the affordability, the rental yield, etc. So how can you make, a dollar stretch further, one Hong Kong dollar, to be more efficient, to perform for your investment in overseas? So another part also is because that I think a lot of demand for self-usage, especially, we're talking about kids going education, for their university, for work, and etc. And also, of course, for BNO issue, people really need a real house, a real property for their own use, for future use.
Amos, as we all know, Hong Kong properties is ranked most probably the most expensive in the world.
It is.
But how would you compare other factors? If you're buying a property overseas, how would you compare Hong Kong market or an overseas market?
I think, number one, always put overseas property different from Hong Kong, right? It's different. The way the payments is different, the legality is different. So I think a lot of people look at the forex, for example, currency. Hong Kong, you can always trade by Hong Kong dollars. But if you're using, for example, UK for sterling, Japan for yen, and yen is pretty a good currency that people like to hedge anyway. The other part is rental yield. In UK, for example, people could take up to 4 to 5% rental yield. But whereas in Hong Kong, I think 1.5% to 2% is probably you're considering a good rental yield. Therefore, I think people would look at rental yield as a long term, but also, the kind of like what capital growth can I get from overseas, and then subsequently for their own usage.
Right. Since you mentioned the word capital growth, I think Hong Kong properties most probably has gone up like 200% in the last 10 years.
Exactly.
So if you compare buying a property overseas, the opportunity cost, would you say that the increase is less overseas in terms of gain?
Well, I think in buying overseas is quite different from Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, you can only look at capital gain, right? Or maybe some rental, but very minimum, as I said. But for overseas, you can actually earn three things. Number one would be the capital growth. Number two would be the currency exchange, because currency exchange basically is tax-free. And the three is the rental yield, and the rental yield which is much higher, right? So basically, these three are the major reasons why people are investing overseas. So, and apart from that, when you said about the capital growth opportunity, well, of course, Hong Kong is one place that keeps going up, right? One direction. But I think in overseas, people also think the value for money. For example, a 600 square foot apartment in UK versus in Hong Kong, what can you get? And also, some places basically has very strong capital growth. For example, London. London has always been named of the investment haven because over the last 30 years of track record, you could see that no matter in which part of the time you buy a UK property, okay, or you bought a UK property, even at the highest price, so long you keep for 10 years, you will always be higher than what you purchase. So therefore, UK property, especially only London, it's named to be the investment haven for all the billionaires overseas.
Right, Amos, since you mentioned the word exchange rate, this is something I'd personally like to ask you. Sure. And the pound sterling was $16 to one Hong Kong, to 16 Hong Kong dollars to £1 before. Now it's about $10 something. Australian dollars was over $8 to one Australian dollar. Now it's about $5 something. So there is, I've calculated about 30% depreciation.
Exactly.
So is it now the good time to buy those properties, or do you think the risk is still very high.
Precisely, Eugene. I think this is the timing. I always say, when you invest into overseas property, always look at currency, because this could be the major difference on your gain or not. So, for example, in UK, I would think it's a good timing because after the Brick exit, it's confirmation, everything is done. It went down to 9 actually for like less than 24 hours exchange, and then now it's about 10.5. I would think that it's quite a good timing. The reason is because in 2008, where the Lehman Brothers crash, you could see that the sterling was around 12 point something, all the way to 13.3 for the last 4 or 5 years. So 10.5 is a good hit. And I would think that, I reckon that UK sterling would probably go up above $11 in the next few months or year, which last year I predicted, above 10. It's really 10.5.
Right. Amos, since you have discussed with us why the reason, the rationale why you want to consider buying overseas property. And of course, people is going to ask us where and what to buy. So which country, apart from UK, that you just mentioned, do you recommend Hong Kongers to consider?
Well, I think it depends on the investors' kind of risk factor. Singapore is one of the places that people are really like because of stability. Although the prices increase, a lot of restrictions are there, but Singapore is pretty much like Hong Kong. Prices keep going up.
Right.
Number 2, I think, would always be the Australia, or even sometimes Canada, because of the number of the Hong Kong people who own a citizenship in Australia or Canada.
Right.
And the other one would be actually Japan, because of like Expo, where Expo coming up in 2025. And I think the most important is because of yen. Yen play would play a big part on the Japan property. So these are the few cities or the country that I think has a better opportunity for our investors.
How about Malaysia, other countries?
To be completely honest, I think
Thailand?
Malaysia, Thailand would take a long time. I always tell the investors who wants to invest in Malaysia or Thailand that it's not an immediate play. No, it's a fast out and going play, because it is second tier city, right? Or sometimes it takes years to grow. For example, Malaysia and Thailand, I would think you need to look at least 5 to 7 years play. And if you talk about third tier city, it would be more than 10 years.
Amos, as I always mention in the show, when you talk about properties, you talk about location. Exactly. So you have mentioned some popular countries or cities. How do an average Hong Konger who hasn't lived there or studied there know which are the good areas?
Well, I think now the data, statistics, are very transparent, right? It's easy for you to go into any part of the website to go and check all those prices. For example, in London, it's so transparent, the prices. Singapore, even much clearer. You can even extract the data out. So I guess there's a lot of reports, a lot of things showing on property prices, property trends, as well as transactions. How long does one property actually can be resell in UK London, for example? Immediately record month after month, the records are there, very transparent. So I guess buyers now are a lot more luckier than my time or your time. Those days we could only base on some agency, but now everything is right on the data.
Right. In Hong Kong, we always do off-plan sales in Hong Kong. You look at the newspapers. Do you suggest people to buy a second-hand property or go for the off-plan properties?
Well, I think off-plan would always be my suggestion. It's because of cash flow, number 1. Unlike Hong Kong.
Cash flow meaning they have a few years for you to pay up the deposit?
Exactly.
Right.
And also because Hong Kong is quite different, right? The moment you buy a property, even if it's off-plan, you need to start your installment plan.
If you want to get the best deal.
Exactly. But in UK, for example, you could actually pay 10% or 20% max. And then you wait for completion in 2, 3, 4 years down the road. So from then, you could actually, number 1, use your money elsewhere for other investment. Second time, wait for the capital growth by the time you collect a flat. And number 3, actually the risk factor, right? For example, in 2 to 3 years, some of the cities you could even do your conform more, which is assignment of sales.
Right.
Which could actually earn some kind of, your money even before the completion. Of course, not every case.
Right. Amos, you just mentioned, tax must be something we have to talk about.
Sure.
You have capital gain tax, which Hong Kong doesn't have. They have inheritance tax.
Sure.
And also your annual profit tax.
Of course.
So how would you compare investing in an overseas property as compared to Hong Kong? Are you better off in Hong Kong where you are sort of a simple tax system? What do you think?
I think number 1, when you purchase a second property in Hong Kong as an investment, that's 15%, 1.5, right? 15% of what Hong Kong property prices, the number is huge. But if you compare to with UK, for example, you don't have to pay that much. You know, your stamp duty would be about 5 to 8%, for example. Well, if you talk about inheritance tax, actually there's a lot of tax planning that you could help to reduce. And in UK, you actually had basically this tax beneficial for the first 325,000. And also, if you talk about income tax, you could actually do a leverage, basically using your interest rate, bank interest rate, to do as offset. So there's a lot of expenses you could actually offset for tax.
As I recall, when you used to buy a UK property, there's basically no capital gains tax for a foreign investor until 2015, 15th of April, where they come in with a tax. Has that deterred many people from investing in England?
Actually, not at all. Actually, not at all, because I think paying a capital gain tax for UK itself, for its own citizens, you have to pay. But for foreigners those days, you don't have to pay. So for the UK, basically for UK citizens, they feel it's unfair, right? And also, capital gain is only on your gain. Right. So if you're not making a gain, you don't have to pay. Right. So I think it makes sense for someone who make money in some other cities to pay the capital gain tax, although I feel that the capital gain tax can be planned earlier to reduce the tax.
Okay. Maybe we'll go for a break, and don't go away. Welcome back. We have been talking with Mr. Amos Lee on whether buying overseas property is a wise move. Amos, in the first part, we talk about why you want to buy an overseas property, what to buy, and where to buy. On the what to buy, do you recommend people to buy a studio flat, or you want to buy a house with land?
I think it's all different. If you start with a first time as an investor, I think a studio is so much easy because it's low entry level, right? Right. And also, I think a studio or one bedroom is easy to rent. But however, I feel if you want a capital growth, a 2-bedroom or above, it's always more appreciation. The reason is because for studio and 1-bedroom, you can only look at for people for rent or investment. Right. So therefore, your clientele is limited, right? Your buyer will be limited. But whereas if you look at 2-bedrooms, 3-bedrooms, you can look at family, you can look for investors. So there's a lot of more different, kind of clienteles that you can look for. So I would recommend if you're looking for first-time investment as trial, studio 1-bed, good enough. Right. But if you're looking at capital growth, like myself, I always like 2-bedrooms and above. Right. Yep.
Amos, you mentioned that one of the good things about owning overseas property is to rent it out and get a good rental yield. As I understand, for example, in UK, where most people are considering, or even Australia, their agency or the maintenance costs, say repairs, say their strata fees, are actually quite high as compared to Hong Kong. How many % will you have to allocate out in terms of your budget, say from rental, in terms of net return? I
would think that, for example, in UK, I always look at what's the service charge, right? I mean, always tell others, the more facilities you have in the project, the more fees you're going to pay.
Same thing in Hong Kong.
Exactly. So, but I think in Hong Kong it's quite different. Even you pay a management fee, the swimming pool you still got to pay for a fee. The gym is still going to pay for a fee, but in UK, you don't have to pay for it anymore. But yet, having said that, I would think that if your rental yield is, let's say, 4%, you will allocate about 0.5% out for your service charge or the other things, and then another 0.5% probably for the commission for the agency. That left with about 3%. I would think about 1%. It's almost the max that I would pay for it.
Another area I want to ask you is actually about the liquidity.
Okay.
In Hong Kong, basically, if the price is right, I think you can have a property sold within 1 to 2 months and get the money from your lawyers. How about, say, in overseas properties? Can we expect this same turnover time, or it's going to take longer to sell?
I think it's also depending on cities. For example, like what Eugenie said, location. I think in London, it's a lot faster. In fact, in last year, during COVID, even the toughest time, if you have a property price, which makes sense in market price, it takes about 62 days for you to market. It takes about 62 days. And the fastest is about 40 over days. So I would think that reckon 1.5 months to about 2 to 3 months would be the period for selling in UK, London, only London, okay? But I think in other part of the world, for example, if you sell in Bangkok, in Malaysia, it takes a lot longer. So therefore, I think it's like what you said, location. Singapore, it's going to be fast. Hong Kong, super fast. UK, also fast. Japan will be depending on location as well.
Since you just mentioned COVID, as you know, a lot of places are in lockdown. That means people are working from home.
Sure.
And I read an article saying that people are actually staying away from the prime, London or even Singapore, stay away from the actual city, and they're moving to the suburbs. Have you seen that?
I think last year you did see some of the, major working area, central CBD, having a lot of vacancies, right? But actually, because of now, we're talking about booster shots already. We're talking about third vaccination, right? So people are going back to work very much. For example, in UK, Singapore, people are back to their work. People, you get to see that places like Canary Wharf in City, basically the tenants are back. So they're asking for higher rent. In fact, I do have a few transactions recently where the forecast for the rental is a lot higher than what we sell.
Oh, really?
Exactly. So I think it depends on timing. But if you're buying a good location, I would think it's a period of time. Your rent or your property prices is always going to be back to normal and back to track.
Right. Amos, so far we've been talking to the very positive sides of investing overseas property. Let me bring us to what I read in the South China Morning Post.
Okay.
It said that there have been increasing complaints from Hong Kongers after purchasing overseas property because of bad advice from local agents. The Consumer Council in the report said the number of complaints from the sale of new homes outside of Hong Kong has jumped 60% since 2017 to 56 cases last year. Not a high number, but high enough for us to be concerned.
Sure.
And complaints including people buying from in Thailand, UK, or even Australia. Can you tell us a bit more on that?
No doubt. Actually, the more sales you created, the more complaints you get. I think the number of cases increases because the number of transactions on overseas property has become really, really popular. So if you talk about the detailed number from the report, actually you show that 60 to 70% of the buyer actually buy from developers directly. There's only 30% basically is related to agency. Of course, in every industry, there are some good eggs and bad eggs, right? Well, in this case, I think a lot are happening because they're buying from non-experienced agency or agency who haven't done their due diligence. For example, you're paying a deposit that is a lot higher than the norm. For example, 50%, 60%, and then you got those guarantee buyback, guarantee rental for 10 years. Those schemes are where I would put concern with. Having said that, regulated, I have no objection on it, so long it's regulated properly and regulated according to what the overseas regulations, right? I think it fulfills the overseas market.
So it sounds like the agents selling overseas property now in Hong Kong, they don't need to have a license. Am I correct to say?
You're right.
So if there's no local regulation, are you worried?
I am. You know why? Because these bad eggs will damage us. It will basically spread. If some cases gone wrong, it comes to us, who is probably running the business.
Right.
But having said that, I would think that regulation is important, but it has to go according to the overseas, the practice. Because buying an overseas property and buying a Hong Kong property is entirely different.
As you said, there are a lot of differences.
Exactly. So it has to go accordingly. So I would think that as an agent, basically, due diligence is something that you can't avoid. You have to do it. The second part is basically holding the hands on the buyers. The complaint on 70% basically are buyers who is trying to go directly to developers to get some good deals, but in the end, they didn't get a service, and hence, a lot of complaints come into place.
Right. Is there a global licensing body that the Hong Kong agents can go for exams for?
No, they are not. At the moment, there are really none of the license they can do. Anyone, can be an agent tomorrow.
As you know, as a Hong Konger, if you read the newspapers, you see advertisements. If you go home, you see a mailbox, you have those adverts coming in.
Sure.
Or if you walk to any major hotels in Hong Kong over the weekends, you see exhibitions. So is that a norm to sell overseas property in Hong Kong through those means?
Definitely. Actually, this has been over the last 10 or 15 years. Exhibitions holding in weekends, in different hotels, for example. You get to see mailers, everything. But to be honest, some good developers are very, very strict in advertising. In fact, they need agency like us to show them each of the advertising that we are doing, the marketing design, make sure the wordings are right, make sure the walking distances to the stations is right. So all the information, they're so careful, even in wordings, they will be they has to use certain wording, certain colors to match with it. That's why I said reputable developers are as important.
You know, in Hong Kong, if you're going to buy a property, I'm sure the viewers will tell you they're going to visit once or twice, if not 10 times before they make a decision.
Sure.
But over this weekend, if they go through a property exhibition, as we said earlier before the show, you said people actually come in and actually they sign the contract and actually purchase something without actually having seen it.
Sure.
I mean, how successful have those past buyers been?
I think the complaint is only really just a small number. If you get to see most of the transaction that's been done overseas, a lot of people have made money, but they wouldn't come out to say, I make money, right? And also, I think technology does help a lot. For example, now you can easily go into any map that you can see places that we can't even see when we are virtually there. For example, you could see from the satellite, right? You know, what is next door, how many stories are next door. But even you go on to right on the spot in the site for site visit, you couldn't see it, could you? For example, you couldn't see what the views are. So I think technology does help a lot.
Right.
And also, I think the agency, how much and how prepared they are. For example, the lawyers, you know, are they explaining the right contract?
So there are lawyers on site?
Of course.
Right. Some have suggested there should be a cooling off period for overseas property purchasers, say like 7 days. If they don't like it, they always get their money back. Sure. Do you agree to that?
I don't, because even buying Hong Kong property, you don't get cooling off period, do you? So I think that's the same for overseas.
But I mean, for my personal information, even in Australia, some of the states, they do give a cooling off period. So if that country does allow a cooling off period, do you think it's something that we can consider?
I think that makes some sense. Okay, for example, in Canada, you can do the cooling off, right? You have to follow it. But in UK, you don't really need a cooling off period. I don't think we need to practice on it because it does apply on us. And because if you don't buy, actually the UK buyer is going to buy. It's the same thing. So it's very unfair as well for the developers. Holding up a unit for you, it's easy to put a deposit. And then 7 days down the road, I decided not to buy. So who is going to pay for the opportunity cost?
Amos, in the last part of the show, I'm going to ask you, as you know, Hong Kong is getting more and more integrated with the mainland.
Yeah.
Personally, we've been talking about investing overseas. Do you think Hong Kong people should be investing more into Hong Kong and mainland since this is going to be our new direction? I
think that as an investor, you need to diversify your investments, whether it's in Hong Kong, in China, or in overseas. I invest in China, I invest in Hong Kong, but I invest a lot in overseas. Right. I don't want to put all my eggs in one basket, do we?
Good comment. Thank you, Amos, for sharing with our viewers your experience in the overseas property market. I'm sure this has given many of us food for thought. Thank you for joining us. Have a good week and good night.